Say it again." My son's voice cut through the room, sharp and loud enough that even the lawyer stopped mid-sentence. And then he leaned forward slightly, his expression tight with something between anger and certainty as he added, "If that Shrew gets a share, I am not signing anything." The word hung in the air longer than it should have, heavier than the quiet office could hold, and for a moment no one moved. Not the lawyer, not the relatives seated along the walls, not even Clara beside him, who only lowered her gaze briefly before straightening her posture as if the statement had already been justified in her mind. I sat where I had been from the beginning, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture unchanged because movement would have suggested reaction, and reaction was not something I was willing to offer in a moment that had already revealed more than any response could. I could feel the shift immediately, not in words, but in attention, in the way eyes moved, in the way silence settled differently now, no longer respectful, no longer neutral, but edged with something else, something that placed me at a distance from the room I had once belonged to without question. The lawyer cleared his throat softly, attempting to restore order, but the balance had already been disturbed. And everyone present understood that what had just been said could not be undone simply by continuing to read from a document. My son leaned back slightly in his chair, his jaw set, his confidence unshaken, as if he believed that by saying it out loud, by placing that word in front of everyone, he had secured something, established a position that could not be challenged. And I watched him carefully, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a level of clarity that had been building quietly long before this moment arrived. Clara reached for his hand briefly, a small gesture, almost unnoticed, but it carried meaning, a silent reinforcement of what he had just done, a confirmation that the version of reality he was presenting was one she supported without hesitation. And I understood then that this was not a sudden outburst, not a loss of control, but something far more deliberate, something that had been forming over time, shaped by conversations I had not heard and assumptions I had not corrected. I did not speak, because there was nothing I needed to say to change what had already been revealed. And instead, I allowed the moment to continue without interruption. Because when people show you what they believe, it is more valuable than anything they might explain afterward. The lawyer finally resumed, his voice measured, his tone carefully neutral as he returned to the document in front of him, but the words now carried a different weight. Each line no longer just a formal reading, but a quiet contradiction to what had just been declared. And I could see it in the subtle tension that returned to the room, in the way my son's attention sharpened again, in the way Clara's posture became more rigid, as if they were both listening now, not just for information, but for confirmation of something they were no longer entirely certain about. I remained still, my gaze steady, my presence unchanged, because what had begun with a single word was no longer about insult. It was about belief. And belief, once spoken publicly, has a way of revealing the structure beneath it, whether that structure can support it or not. And as the lawyer continued, I understood with complete certainty that whatever my son thought he was protecting in that moment, whatever position he believed he had secured, it was built on something he had never truly seen, something that would not remain hidden much longer, no matter how loudly he tried to define it. The lawyer continued reading, his voice steady but now carrying an undercurrent that had not been there before, as if even he understood that what he was about to say would not simply be heard, but examined, measured against the words that had just filled the room. And I watched as my son leaned forward again, his earlier confidence still present, but no longer as effortless, his focus sharper, more deliberate, as though he were listening not just to confirm what he believed, but to guard against anything that might challenge it. Clara remained beside him, her posture composed, her expression controlled, yet there was a subtle tension, in the way she held herself. A stillness that suggested she was no longer entirely certain of the ground beneath her. And I recognized that shift immediately, because uncertainty does not need to be spoken to be seen. The lawyer reached a section that caused a brief pause, not because he hesitated, but because the structure of what he was reading required it. And in that pause, the room seemed to lean inward, attention narrowing, expectation rising in ways that no one openly acknowledged. And then he continued, outlining details that, on the surface, appeared straightforward. References to accounts, distributions, and arrangements that had been in place for years, long before this moment, long before any assumptions had been made about who controlled what. My son nodded slightly as he listened, as if each line confirmed something he already knew, and I could see how easily perception attaches itself to familiar words, how quickly people accept what aligns with what they expect to hear. And yet I also knew that understanding does not come from isolated details, it comes from structure, from how those details connect, and that connection had not yet been revealed. One of the relatives shifted in their seat, glancing briefly in my direction before looking away again, and I understood that the room was still adjusting, still trying to reconcile what had been said earlier with what was now being presented, and that reconciliation was incomplete, unstable, waiting for something more definitive. The lawyer turned a page, his movements precise, his tone unchanged, and as he continued, the language became more specific, more defined, moving beyond general statements into something more structured, more intentional, and I could see the moment when my son's expression altered. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but in the smallest tightening around his eyes, the kind that appears when something does not align perfectly with expectation. Clara noticed it as well, her gaze shifting toward him for just a second before returning to the document, and that brief exchange, that silent acknowledgement, carried more meaning than any words could have added. I remained exactly as I had been, my posture steady, my expression calm, because nothing in this moment required adjustment from me. Everything was unfolding exactly as it had been designed to, not through reaction, not through confrontation, but through clarity. And clarity has a way of revealing itself gradually, piece by piece, until it can no longer be ignored. The lawyer's voice continued to fill the room, steady and controlled. And with each line, the structure became more visible, not fully exposed, but no longer hidden beneath assumption. And I could feel the shift taking hold, subtle but undeniable, as the narrative that had been spoken so confidently moments earlier began to lose its foundation, not through contradiction, but through something far more precise, something that did not argue, did not challenge, but simply existed. My son adjusted his position again, his attention now fixed entirely on the document, no longer scanning the room, no longer projecting certainty outward, but drawing inward, focusing on what was being said. And in that shift, I saw the beginning of something he had not anticipated. Not a realization yet, but the quiet recognition that what he believed might not be complete. And that recognition, once it begins, does not stop until it reaches its conclusion. I let the moment continue without interruption, because interruption would have broken the rhythm. And rhythm, in a situation like this, matters. It allows understanding to build naturally, without force, without resistance. And as the lawyer turned another page, preparing to continue, I understood with complete certainty that the distance between perception and reality was narrowing, and that soon, very soon, there would be nothing left to separate them. The lawyer did not look up as he continued, but there was a subtle shift in his tone, not louder, not slower, just more precise, as if each word now carried a weight that required careful placement And I could see my son reacting to that change without fully understanding why. His attention narrowing further, his earlier certainty no longer extending beyond what he could immediately grasp. Clara remained still beside him, her hands resting lightly together. But her focus had sharpened, no longer passive, no longer simply aligned with his confidence, but actively searching, as though she had begun to sense that what was unfolding was not as straightforward as it had seemed at the start. The lawyer referenced dates then, older than expected, tied to agreements that predated many of the assumptions being made in that room, and I watched as my son's expression shifted again, just slightly, his eyes lingering a fraction longer on each detail, as if trying to place them within a framework he had always taken for granted. One of the relatives leaned forward, their curiosity no longer hidden, and the quiet of the room deepened, not empty, but concentrated, as if everyone present had begun to realize that this was no longer a simple reading, but something more layered, something that required attention beyond surface understanding. The lawyer turned another page, the sound of paper unusually distinct in the stillness, and when he continued, the language became more structured, more defined, referencing ownership in ways that did not align neatly with what had been declared earlier, and I could feel the shift settling in more firmly now. Not dramatic, not disruptive, but undeniable. My son adjusted his position again. This time, more noticeably, his shoulders tightening slightly as he leaned closer to the document. No longer projecting outward, no longer concerned with how he appeared to others, but focused entirely on what he was hearing. And in that focus, I saw the beginning of a realization that had not yet fully formed, but was no longer avoidable. Clara glanced at him again, her expression more serious now, less assured. And for the first time since the reading began, she did not immediately return her gaze to the lawyer, instead holding that glance for a moment longer. As if confirming something she could not yet articulate, I remained still, my presence unchanged, because this was not a moment that required intervention. It required completion. And completion cannot be rushed. It must unfold in its own sequence, each detail connecting to the next, until the full structure becomes visible. The lawyer paused briefly once more, not hesitating, but allowing the information to settle. And in that pause, I noticed how the room had shifted entirely. No longer aligned with the narrative that had been spoken so confidently before, but suspended between what had been believed and what was now being revealed. My son's gaze lifted for a moment, not toward me, but toward the space in front of him, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that could no longer exist together. And when his eyes returned to the document, there was a difference, subtle but clear, the kind that marks the beginning of understanding even before it is fully accepted. The lawyer resumed, his voice steady as ever, and as he moved into the next section, I understood with complete certainty that the foundation my son had relied on was no longer holding in the way he expected, not because it had been challenged, but because it had never been what he believed it to be. And as the words continued to unfold, I knew that what remained hidden was growing smaller with each passing moment, and that soon there would be nothing left for assumption to stand on at all. The lawyer adjusted the document slightly, his fingers aligning the edges with quiet precision before continuing, and when he spoke again, there was no change in volume, no added emphasis, yet the clarity of his words seemed to settle deeper into the room, as though each sentence now carried a weight that could not be ignored. He began to outline the framework in more explicit terms, referencing not only the assets themselves but the legal structure that governed them, and as those details unfolded, I could see the effect immediately, not in any dramatic reaction, but in the gradual tightening of my son's expression, the way his attention became more fixed, more deliberate, as if he were trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he had always assumed. Clara leaned forward slightly, her composure still intact. but no longer effortless. Her eyes scanning the page more carefully now, as though the language itself had shifted into something that required interpretation rather than acceptance. The lawyer continued, describing the formation of a trust established years earlier, structured with clear terms, clear authority. And as those words were spoken, the room seemed to settle into a deeper silence, not empty, but concentrated, as if everyone present understood that they were no longer listening to general provisions, but to something far more specific, something that defined control in a way that could not be easily redirected. My son's posture changed again, subtle but undeniable. His shoulders drawing in slightly, his focus narrowing to the document alone, no longer scanning the room, no longer projecting outward. And in that shift, I saw the first clear sign that the foundation he had relied on was beginning to move beneath him. Clara's gaze lifted briefly toward him, searching, confirming, and then returned to the page, her earlier certainty replaced by a quiet intensity that revealed more than any spoken question could have. I remained still, my presence unchanged, because this moment did not require intervention. It required completion, and completion comes not from interruption, but from allowing each detail to connect in its own time. The lawyer turned another page, the motion slow and deliberate, and as he continued, the language became even more precise, outlining the authority vested within the trust, specifying control, decision-making power, and the conditions under which distributions would be made. And with each line, the distinction between assumption and reality grew sharper, clearer, until it could no longer be overlooked. My son's breathing seemed to slow, not noticeably to anyone who was not watching closely, but enough that it marked a shift from confidence to concentration, from certainty to evaluation. And I understood that what he was encountering now was not contradiction, but structure. Something that does not argue, does not persuade, but simply exists in a way that cannot be altered by belief. One of the relatives shifted again. The sound of movement unusually distinct in the stillness, and I could feel the room adjusting once more, not toward any new narrative, but toward the absence of the old one. The quiet realization that what had been spoken earlier no longer aligned with what was now being presented. The lawyer paused briefly, allowing the information to settle, and in that pause, I saw my son glance once more at the document, his expression no longer guarded by certainty, but open to something else. Something that had not yet fully formed but could not be dismissed. And as the lawyer resumed, moving toward the section that would connect everything together, I understood with complete certainty that the moment my son believed he controlled had already passed, and that what remained now was not a matter of interpretation, but of recognition. A recognition that would not need to be explained once it was fully seen. The lawyer's voice remained steady as he reached the section that no longer described general structure, but defined authority in unmistakable terms. And the shift in the room was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. As if something invisible had just been placed firmly in front of everyone, something that could not be ignored once it was seen. He outlined the role of the trustee, the origin of the trust itself, and the conditions under which any distribution could occur. And with each sentence, the framework became clearer, more complete, until there was no longer any space for assumption to exist beside it. My son's expression tightened further, his earlier posture now fully drawn inward, his attention fixed entirely on the document, and I could see the moment when his understanding began to change. Not all at once, but in a series of small adjustments, each one pulling him further away from the certainty he had carried into the room. Clara remained still, but her stillness had changed, no longer composed out of confidence, but held in place by concentration. Her gaze moving between the lines of the document and my son's reaction, as though she were trying to measure the distance between what they had believed and what was now being revealed. The lawyer continued without pause, referencing dates, signatures, and the legal language that established ownership beyond question. And as those details accumulated, the room seemed to settle into a deeper quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood was already present. One of the relatives shifted again, the sound subtle but noticeable, and I could feel the collective awareness adjusting, not toward a new narrative, but away from the one that had just been spoken with such confidence, the realization spreading without words that what had been assumed no longer held weight. My son finally spoke, his voice lower now, controlled, but lacking the certainty it once carried, asking a question about the structure, about how it had been arranged. And the lawyer answered simply, directly, without elaboration, because elaboration was not necessary when the document itself was clear. Clara's gaze lifted then, not toward the lawyer, but toward me. And in that brief moment, there was no challenge in her expression, no attempt to reinterpret what she had heard, only recognition, the kind that settles quietly when understanding replaces assumption. I remained exactly as I had been, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because nothing in this moment required adjustment from me. Everything was unfolding as it always had been. Only now it was visible. The lawyer turned the final page in that section, his movements precise. And as he continued, the connection between every detail became undeniable. The origin of the assets, the control of the trust, the authority over distribution, all aligned in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. My son leaned back slightly, not in dismissal, but in recognition. His gaze no longer fixed on a single point, but moving, as if searching for something that no longer existed, the certainty he had relied on, now replaced by something else, something quieter, more measured. Clara did not speak, and that silence carried its own weight, because there are moments when questions are no longer needed, when the structure itself provides all the answers. The room remained still as the lawyer finished that section, and in that stillness, I understood with complete certainty that what had once been hidden beneath assumption had now been fully revealed, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through something far more precise, something that did not depend on belief, something that simply was, and once seen, could not be unseen. The lawyer did not rush as he moved into the final portion of the reading, his tone remaining steady, but there was a distinct sense that what followed would no longer add detail, but complete the structure that had already begun to take form. And I watched as my son remained still, his earlier resistance no longer present, replaced by a focused attention that no longer sought confirmation, but understanding. Clara sat beside him with a quiet composure that had shifted entirely from where it began, her gaze fixed on the document, no longer glancing outward, no longer measuring reactions, but absorbing each word as it was delivered. The lawyer referenced the final authority clause, outlining in clear and precise terms who retained control over all decisions related to the trust. And as those words were spoken, the room seemed to narrow in focus, every detail aligning into a single point of clarity that could not be misinterpreted. My son's expression changed again. Not sharply, not visibly to those who were not paying attention, but enough that the certainty he had once held could no longer be found in it, replaced instead by a quiet recognition that what he believed to be his position had never existed in the way he understood. One of the relatives shifted slightly, the movement small but noticeable in the stillness, and I could sense that the realization was no longer isolated. It had extended outward, touching everyone present, reshaping the narrative without a single word needing to be spoken. The lawyer continued, his voice unwavering as he confirmed the role of the primary decision-maker, the individual who held full authority over the distribution and management of all assets within the trust. And when that designation was spoken, it did not arrive as a surprise to me, but as a simple confirmation of what had always been true. My son did not speak immediately, and in that silence, I saw the moment fully settle, not as a sudden collapse, but as a quiet adjustment, the kind that occurs when something deeply held is replaced by something undeniable. Clara's posture shifted slightly, not away, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement, her earlier certainty no longer present, replaced by a stillness that carried its own understanding. The lawyer closed the document then, his hands resting lightly on the desk, signaling that the reading itself had reached its conclusion. And yet the room did not move. No one reached for their belongings. No one spoke, because the moment had not yet fully resolved itself in their minds. I remained exactly as I had been from the beginning, my posture steady, my expression calm, because nothing in this moment required anything further from me. Everything that needed to be said had already been presented with clarity. My son finally lifted his gaze, not toward the lawyer, not toward the others in the room, but toward me. And in that look, there was no longer defiance, no longer certainty, only a quiet recognition that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. I met that gaze without change, without emphasis, because acknowledgement does not require reinforcement when the truth stands clearly on its own. The room remained still for a few seconds longer, before the subtle movements of reality began to return. Chairs shifting, breaths released, the quiet sounds of people adjusting to what had just been understood, and as that movement began, I understood with complete certainty that the moment my son believed he controlled had ended long before this point, and that what remained now was not a matter of argument or explanation, but of acceptance. An acceptance that would shape everything that followed without needing to be stated again. No one moved to leave immediately, not because they were waiting for permission, but because the moment itself had not yet fully settled into something they could step away from. And I allowed that stillness to remain, not prolonging it, not breaking it, simply letting it exist as it was. Because clarity, once introduced, often requires silence to take its full shape. My son remained seated, his hands resting lightly against the arms of his chair, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, but held in a way that suggested he was adjusting internally to something he had not prepared for. And I could see in the way his gaze lingered, not on the documents anymore, but somewhere beyond them, that he was no longer trying to understand what had been said, but what it meant for everything he believed before this moment. Clara sat beside him, her composure intact but transformed, no longer projecting certainty, no longer aligned in quiet reinforcement, but still attentive, as if she were carefully measuring what came next, not through words, but through observation. One of the relatives finally stood, the sound of movement breaking the stillness in a way that felt almost hesitant, as though even that simple act required acknowledgement of what had just taken place. And gradually, others followed, not speaking, not exchanging comments, but shifting back into motion with a quiet awareness that the room they were leaving was not the same as the one they had entered. The lawyer gathered the documents with the same precision he had shown throughout, placing them into a neat stack, his expression neutral, professional, because for him this was structure, not conflict, something defined and concluded without emotion. And when he looked toward me briefly, it was not a question, not a prompt, but a simple acknowledgement that everything had been presented as intended. I rose then, not abruptly, not drawing attention, but with the same calm steadiness I had carried from the beginning, and as I did, my son finally stood as well, his movement slower, more deliberate, as if he were no longer stepping into a role, but out of one he had not realized he was holding. For a brief moment, he looked as though he might speak, his expression shifting slightly, searching for something that had once come easily to him, but no words followed, and that absence was more telling than anything he could have said. Clara stepped back slightly, giving him space without making it visible, her posture controlled, her gaze steady, and in that small adjustment, I saw that she understood as well, not just the structure that had been revealed, but the change it required from both of them. I met my son's gaze once more, not with expectation, not with judgment, but with the same quiet certainty that had carried through every moment of this process, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to establish. Everything had already been seen. I turned then and moved toward the door, not waiting, not signaling for anyone to follow, because what had happened here did not need to be discussed further. It would carry forward on its own, shaping what came next without needing to be explained. As I stepped into the hallway, the noise of the outside world returned in small, familiar ways, distant voices, footsteps. The quiet rhythm of a place continuing as it always had, and yet for those who had been in that room, something fundamental had shifted, something that would not return to what it was before. I did not look back, not because I was leaving anything unresolved, but because resolution had already been reached in the only way that mattered, through clarity, through structure, through something that did not depend on acknowledgement to exist. And as I walked forward, I understood with complete certainty that whatever my son chose to do next, whatever he chose to believe after this, it would no longer be built on assumption, because assumption had been replaced by something far more enduring, something that would remain long after this moment had passed. The quiet that followed did not dissolve once the room had emptied. It lingered in a way that extended beyond that space, carried into the days that followed, shaping every interaction without needing to be acknowledged directly. And I noticed it first, not in what was said, but in what was no longer said. The absence of assumption, the absence of casual certainty that had once defined the way my son spoke about everything connected to the estate. When he called 2 days later, his tone was measured, careful in a way that had not been present before. And although his words were simple, asking how I was, confirming small details, there was a noticeable pause between each sentence, as if he were considering not just what to say, but how it would be received. And I responded in the same calm manner I always had, not reinforcing the change, not drawing attention to it, because change does not need to be named to be real. Clara's presence in the background was quieter than before, not distant, but restrained, her voice appearing only briefly, offering a polite greeting that carried none of the quiet authority she had once held. And in that small exchange, I understood that her awareness had settled fully into place, not comfortably, but completely. When we saw each other again a week later, it was in a setting that would have once felt routine, a simple gathering, familiar faces, familiar surroundings, yet everything within it had shifted in a way that did not require explanation, because perception had already been replaced by understanding. My son arrived with a posture that was no longer defined by confidence, but by intention. His movements deliberate, his tone respectful without being forced, and as he spoke, I could hear the adjustment clearly, not in apology, not in correction, but in recognition, the kind that reshapes behavior without needing to declare itself. Clara remained beside him, her composure intact, but no longer projecting control, instead observing, adapting, her attention more measured, as if she were still learning the structure that had always been there, but had only just become visible to her. I did not lead the conversation, did not guide it toward what had happened, because what had happened no longer required discussion. It had already defined itself completely, and what remained now was not resolution, but continuation, the steady movement forward within a framework that had never changed. As the evening unfolded, I noticed how others in the room responded differently as well, their tone more neutral, their assumptions absent, their interactions shaped by what they had witnessed rather than what they had once believed. And in that subtle shift, I saw the full extent of how a single moment, once clarified, can reshape an entire environment without a single additional word being spoken. My son met my gaze more than once, not searching for confirmation, not seeking reassurance, but acknowledging what had been established, and each time I returned that gaze with the same calm steadiness, because acknowledgement, once mutual, does not need to be emphasized. When the gathering came to an end, there were no lingering tensions, no unresolved expressions, only a quiet understanding that what had once been assumed was no longer relevant, and that what stood in its place did not require defense or explanation. It simply existed. Later that night, as I returned home, the stillness felt familiar again. Not because nothing had changed, but because everything had returned to its proper place. And as I moved through the house, setting things down, turning off lights, I understood with complete certainty that what had been revealed was not a shift in reality, but a correction of perception. And once perception is corrected, it does not return to what it was before. It moves forward, shaped by something far more stable, something that does not depend on belief to exist. Time did not rush forward after that evening. It moved with a steady and measured pace, as if everything that needed to change had already done so, and what remained now was simply the natural continuation of a structure that no longer required explanation. My son began to visit more often, not out of obligation, not with the restless energy that once accompanied his presence, but with a quiet consistency that reflected something deeper, something that had shifted within him in a way that did not need to be announced. And in those visits, I noticed how his words were chosen more carefully, how his tone carried a level of consideration that had not been there before, not forced, not exaggerated, but real. Clara accompanied him each time, her demeanor composed as always, yet noticeably different, no longer positioned beside him as reinforcement, but present in her own space, observing, participating without control, and in that subtle change I saw that her understanding had settled fully, not just of the situation, but of her place within it. Conversations between us became simpler, not because there was less to say, but because there was less that needed to be guarded, no unspoken assumptions pressing beneath the surface, no tension waiting to emerge, only a quiet clarity that allowed everything to move without resistance. One afternoon, as we sat together in the living room, my son paused mid-sentence, his expression thoughtful, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he might return to something that had happened, as though he might try to give shape to the shift that had taken place. But instead, he simply nodded slightly, as if acknowledging it internally, and continued speaking about something else. And I understood that this was not avoidance, but acceptance, the kind that does not need to revisit the past to confirm what has already been understood. Clara watched that moment closely, her gaze steady, and then relaxed again, as if she too recognized that there was nothing left to resolve, only something to carry forward. The house felt different in those moments, not changed in its structure, but in its atmosphere, lighter, clearer, as though the weight of misunderstanding had been removed entirely, leaving behind only what had always been true. I did not alter my routines, did not adjust my behavior to accommodate what had happened, because nothing about my position required change. It had never depended on their perception to exist. And now that perception had aligned with reality, everything simply moved as it should. As weeks passed, the rhythm became natural. Visits, conversations, shared moments that no longer carried the undercurrent of assumption. And in that rhythm, I saw how easily things settle when they are built on something solid, something that does not shift with opinion or belief. My son met my gaze more directly now, without hesitation, without the need to measure what stood between us, because there was nothing left to question. And each time I returned that gaze with the same calm steadiness, not as reassurance, but as acknowledgement of what had been established. Clara's presence remained consistent, her interactions respectful, measured, no longer defined by control but by awareness. And in that awareness, there was a quiet adjustment that required no explanation. And as I moved through each day, through each ordinary moment, I understood with complete certainty that what had unfolded had not created something new. It had simply revealed what had always been there. And once revealed, it did not need to be defended. It did not need to be repeated. It existed on its own, shaping everything that followed with a quiet authority that no longer needed to prove itself.